This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.
Metroidvania. Hate the term, love the term, or begrudgingly accept it. The term has come to loosely define games that have some sort of inspirational or mechanical link to Metroid or a certain era of Castlevania games. Being as games like Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night were beloved in the 1990s, those games have heavily inspired a lot of independent games made in the past decade. On Nintendo Switch, a wealth of those types of games have come to the system. Some of them debuted on Switch. Some are ports of games that first debuted on the Wii U or on an Xbox or PlayStation platform. I put together a list of more than 25 games that, to me, are totally worth checking out on Switch, if you're hankering for some form of side-scrolling exploration platformers, or, to keep it simple and short, if you're looking for a new Metroidvania to play. Ranking this list probably would have been painful, so instead, here's just a bunch of games, alphabetically, that are all awesome, starting with the letter A. First up is Alwa's Awakening. The NES inspirations of Alwa's Awakening are readily apparent, from the visuals to the design. While it might conjure more images of games like Solstice as opposed to Metroid, this feels like a game of that era. The focus of Alwa's debut is on puzzle solving as opposed to combat, as the heroine Zoe has to navigate different areas that get rather challenging. Thankfully, there is an assist mode if you're having trouble. Fun fact, the assist mode was added post-launch, which provided its own sets of obstacles and implementation. If you want to hear more about the developers of Alwa's Awakening talking about the assist mode, check out our upcoming feature about their upcoming game, Alwa's Legacy, which should be coming to Switch soon, and you might see more about that in a video later this week. Next up is Axiom Verge. First debuting on PlayStation 4 in 2015, Axiom Verge is the work of indie developer Tom Happ, who started working on the game as a side project in 2010 before going into full development on this retro-styled wonder. It made its Nintendo debut on Wii U in 2016 before hitting Switch in 2017. While heavily inspired by the original NES Metroid, Axiom Verge also pulls from a variety of other games from that era. The gunplay and boss battles remind me a lot of Contra. Some of the exploration and power-ups are evocative of Blaster Master and Bionic Commando. While it has a few issues that bug me, namely later game map exploration being cumbersome, Axiom Verge is an incredible game. The style is amazing, the story builds and goes to some real interesting places. If you haven't checked out Axiom Verge, I can't recommend it enough. And there's still some time to play it before the sequel comes out later in 2020. Our next set is a twofer, Blaster Master Zero and Blaster Master Zero 2. Now, the series Blaster Master isn't really a household name on the NES, but the unique 1988 game could be considered somewhat foundational in the development of what Metroidvania has come to evoke. Almost 30 years later, Inti Creates led the charge on a remake called Blaster Master Zero that took the shoestring localized plot of the original game and crafted more lore in a new yet familiar world. At its heart, Zero smartly iterated on the original game, adding more depth and nuance to the mixture of side-scrolling ATV exploration and top-down dungeon exploring action. I loved Blaster Master Zero when I played it around the launch of the Switch. A sequel, aptly named Blaster Master Zero 2, came out in March 2019 on Switch, expanding the scope of the world to spread across multiple planets as the game veered off into interesting new areas, as it was no longer tethered to being a quasi-remake. While I think I might ultimately prefer the original, both games are great and exciting throwback-styled Metroidvania games that are available on Switch. Our next game is Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Koji Igarashi, affectionately known as Iga, has an important legacy in the lineage of Metroidvanias. He was, after all, responsible for an impressive 6-game run across Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS with the Castlevania series, that include some absolute masterpieces. Aria of Sorrow, specifically, is excellent. He unfortunately rotted away at Konami after 2008's Castlevania Order of Ecclesia, but he escaped eventually and launched a Kickstarter for Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. It took a few years, but Bloodstained finally launched in 2019. While it was a good example of why I always liked the Metroid side more than the Vania side, Bloodstained completed what it aimed to do. Igarashi and his team made a game in the same style of his old GBA and DS Castlevania games. It might be overwhelmed with crafting and cooking systems, but Bloodstained is a game made with love that is still getting content thanks to Kickstarter stretch goals. Chasm is our next game. That started life back in 2012, took shape after a successful 2013 Kickstarter. However, it took about 5 years before Chasm eventually came out in 2018. I feel like it got overlooked by some just because of the order in that it came out. The PC, PS4, and Vita versions came first, at a time when the Vita was dead and the PS4 was not the indie haven it once was. A Switch release a few months later was overwhelmed by the fact that Switch had approximately 30 games released a week. I reviewed it on Switch and fell in love almost immediately. Chasm leans more on the Vania side of the genre, but what is most novel about it is the way it uses procedural generation. Every new game you start will feature the same story in certain specific areas, but for the most part, it is entirely fresh. It might be a little off-putting to some, but the care that went into making the generated areas insert into the handmade parts is evident. This feels like a game a lot of people missed, and it's worth going back to, especially since the developers added in a daily run mode that lets you play with the procedurally generated areas in new ways. Our next game is Dandara. The visuals of Dandara make it look like you would know what to expect when you sit down with it, but I almost guarantee that you won't. Inspired by the history of the Brazilian historical figure of the same name, Dandara puts you in control of a woman exploring a mysterious world that can only be traversed by jumping from wall to wall. That's right, there's no directional running or control here. It's all about jumping from wall to wall, avoiding death and attacking enemies. Aside from that quirk, the structure is familiar for the genre. When I reviewed it back in early 2018, some of the late game difficulty was extremely punishing. I'm happy to say that the 2020 free Trials of Fear update smoothed out those issues, and also added in a few more areas, as well as more lore. I appreciate that developers at Long Hat House went back to their game and beefed up the content, paved over some rough patches, because even when I had some frustration with it, I was just spellbound by the presentation, which features excellent sound design and a banger of a soundtrack. The next game is one that everybody should probably know about. That's Dead Cells, which could be the central part in my thesis on why early access might be the best possible incubation for video games. I didn't play Dead Cells until it came to Switch in mid-2018, but a lot of other people did play Dead Cells, starting at its early access launch in 2017. I didn't experience the changes the game underwent in that year, but I can tell you the final product is amazing. The fact it's a roguelike might scare some people off, but Dead Cells mixes the gameplay style with a progression that is evocative of Metroid-style design, hence why it's on the list. You're trying to make your way through the game without dying, but along the way you find new abilities that unlock new areas and alternate paths. The feedback loop is engrossing, as you can always be working towards something, whether it's finding new blueprints or searching for a specific secret exit. Dead Cells also does that thing where it's extremely fun to play even if you suck at it, which is a very difficult level to achieve in roguelikes. Also, Dead Cells does the thing where if you put enough time into it, you're probably just going to be so uber powerful that you'll likely be able to beat the final boss even if you're overall pretty terrible at these types of video games. Even more amazing, Dead Cells is still getting frequent updates 2 years after launch, most of which are free. This game is amazing. The next game is Eagle Island, and well, a lot of these games on this list I reviewed when they first came out. Most of them were great from the outset, but Eagle Island is a game that didn't really jive with me initially. The art is top-tier pixel work, and the falconry-based combat is a lot of fun. But initially I was frustrated by the repetition born out of the procedurally generated design. However, in September 2019, Eagle Island released a gigantic update that refined and fixed a ton about the game, adding a different difficulty setting amid other control refinements. As of this writing, the summer 2020 update is out on PC and coming to Switch very soon, adding even more tweaks and additions, revamping control and aiming, as well as a more nuanced checkpoint system. I enjoyed the first major update and look forward to the upcoming one on Switch. Eagle Island is a great example of how a promising game can be made better through updates and refinement. This is a different, better game since launch, and if the update isn't out by the time this video goes live, you should keep an eagle eye out for it. Because maybe it'll be on sale when the update comes out, and it's probably worth checking out. Like, look at it. It looks great. The next game is Gato Roboto, where you're a cat in a mech suit. It's cute as hell. Alright, we can move on to the next game, because what else do you need to know? Okay, so if you want to know more about Gato Roboto, it's a saccharine sweet, adorable Metroid homage. In lieu of a badass space warrior working their way through an alien planet, you're a kitty taking over a robot suit. That hook goes a long way, even if the game is overall relatively short. It might be over in about 3 or 4 hours at the most, but it's also available at a relatively low price, and it's jam-packed with affection for these types of games. The monochromatic presentation is charming, and the soundtrack helps to give off that Metroid but quirky feel Gato Roboto is aiming for. As long as you go into this expecting something a little bit more flighty than intense, it's a hell of a good time. And we've got another twofer. That's Guacamelee and its sequel, Guacamelee 2. I'm gonna focus mostly on the sequel, but both of the Guacamelee games from DrinkBox Studios are excellent. The series debuted on PlayStation platforms in 2013, and was welcomed to the Wii U a year later. The sequel also first came to PlayStation, but thankfully for our purposes, the wait for the Switch release was only a matter of months. Guacamelee verges on parody of the Metroidvania, with things like Chuzo statues modeled after the famous Metroid bird power-up holders. But that parody is mostly in the background, and not in the execution. Every ability the luchador hero Juan earns generally serves a combat and movement purpose, as in addition to exploring, the game focuses heavily on brawler combat. The visual style for both games is flashy and fun, and you could look at the first game and maybe label it a little bit on the short side, but the sequel ups the ante quite a bit. A special note is the preposterous story that involves the Mexican multiverse called the Mexiverse, and requires Juan to travel to different dimensions. Both games are worth playing, and they even also have multiplayer co-op throughout the entire game, if you want to do that. So I think there's some kind of law or regulation that I have to include Hollow Knight on this list, even if, in the grand scheme of things, I'm not as head over heels in love with it as the rest of the world. Now, before you go into the comments, let me be clear. I really like Hollow Knight. The visuals are beautiful, the combat is deep and fun, and the exploration of the overall vast world of the Hollow Nest is enthralling. What really irks me about Hollow Knight is the Dead Soulsification of it. I'm okay with, say, some secret or late game areas and bosses being really tough, which is the case for a number of parts of Hollow Knight. The Mantis Lords send their regards. What almost turned me away from Hollow Knight completely was how punitively tough the beginning is. If you're not clicking with it, you're just gonna get destroyed. Anyway, that's it. I'm off my soapbox. My only beef with Hollow Knight is I think the opening is rough for first timers. Other than that, this game absolutely rocks. The hype is real. You should totally play it. And just remember to push through the first hour or two if you have a hard time. It's worth it. Can't wait for the sequel, Silksong. Next is Iconoclasts. And while a lot of the games on this list have great sprite art, Iconoclasts might have the absolute prettiest. It's a little more linear of a game compared to others listed here, but with a nice progression of abilities that make the movement and environmental puzzles a blast to explore, the linearity doesn't get in the way of all that much. The story is the focus, telling a surprisingly dense tale involving a villainous religion and lots of drama. Taking nearly a decade to see the light of day from Joaquin Sandberg, who, fun fact, is the brother of the director of the Shazam movie. Iconoclasts is an enjoyable romp, even if the colorful pop aesthetic might seem somewhat at odds with the turns the story takes. But hey, the boss battles are huge and awesome. Iconoclasts is a pretty great game. The next game is Kunai, which is named after the coolest item you get in the video game. Early on, your playable tablet, named Tabby, gets a pair of kunai as weapons, and also Spider-Man-esque tools for swinging. I was interested in the game the first time I saw that part of it, and the whole experience lived up to the promise of the kunai swinging mechanic. In typical Metroidvania fashion, you get a whole bunch of other items and abilities along the way, most of which tie beautifully into the freedom of movement afforded to you by the titular kunai. The contrasting colors of the presentation look striking along the way, as you explore a variety of different areas with wonderfully designed puzzles and challenges. I love kunai so much that when I reviewed it, I said, quote, "It could easily stand toe-to-toe with the likes of Ori and the Blind Forest and The Messenger," which I might spoil 2 games coming later on this list, but also I agree with that. Kunai is great. Monster Boy and the Cursed Kingdom is our next game. And well, the Monster Boy / Wonder Boy / Monster World series is one that you should catch up on if you're unfamiliar. The initially Japan-only Monster World 4 is out there on some download services. Wonder Boy the Dragon's Trap was lovingly remade on Switch in 2017, and honestly, maybe it should be on this list, but I already have too many games, so just check out Wonder Boy the Dragon's Trap, it's great. Anywho, in 2018, Game Atelier created a brand new game in that style, Monster Boy and the Cursed Kingdom. You start off as a boy, a soon-to-be monster boy, that is, who gets transformed into different creatures that all have unique abilities. Those are basically your Metroid-esque keys and moves. The visually stunning game also has an incredible soundtrack to go alongside it, with music from legendary composers like Yuzo Koshiro and Moto Sakuraba. Aside from a few difficulty spikes, Monster Boy and the Cursed Kingdom is an absolute joy to play. The next game is Ori and the Blind Forest, which is a game that I don't think I really ever expected to be talking about much on a Nintendo channel. I remember when Ori was first announced for Xbox One. I was immediately jealous. This looked like a Metroid-like game that would be at home on Nintendo platforms. It took a while, but in 2019, Ori and the Blind Forest made it to Nintendo Switch. The wait was worth it, as it included all of the game's refinements from its definitive edition. Believe me, you are better off playing the game with the fast travel system. Where Ori absolutely excels is in the presentation and atmosphere. Moving around this vibrant world is a blast, especially as you see the finely tuned artwork and animation of Ori and the different creatures in the world. It's very much a Metroidvania for those who like to explore as opposed to fight. Hopefully, Switch owners will get to experience the sequel, which came out on Xbox early in 2020. Because if it's on par with the original game, Ori and the Will of the Wisps will be a top-flight Switch game. Up next is another game that took a while to make it to Nintendo platforms, and that's Owlboy, which is a game that wears its heart on its sleeve, with lovely pixel art that might hide the fact that the game took almost a decade to release, beginning development in 2007 and first releasing in 2016. It came to Switch in 2018, bringing its owl-centric Metroidvania gameplay to Nintendo platforms. The star is Otis, a mute owl who is looked down upon in his village. A series of events thrust him into a heroic ordeal where he teams up with old and new friends to save the day. Otis can fly, but aside from that, he primarily relies on his partner characters that function as both weapons and keys of sorts. The story drives the heart of this adventure, which takes Otis and his friends to a variety of tough puzzles and battles. Owlboy is worth checking out if you have missed it, as the charming visuals and story are a real treat. Our next twofer really could have been more, because there's a lot of Shantae games, but I'm going to focus on 2. I'm basically lumping the 2 superlative Shantae games as one entry for the sake of this list, mostly because I can't totally vouch for the Switch version of Pirate's Curse, and as of this writing, I'm only about an hour or 2 into 7 Sirens. Shantae and the Pirate's Curse first came to the Nintendo 3DS in 2014, before its Switch port in 2018. It's, pound for pound, my favorite entry in the Shantae series, delivering the lighthearted platforming action the series has retained over its 2-decade run. Pirate's Curse separates itself from other entries in the series by removing the half-genie's dancing powers, replacing them with more traditional Metroidvania items, such as a gun and a hat used primarily for puzzling purposes. 7 Sirens reverts back to the old dancing powers, but adds a few other wrinkles, as a few dancing-related powers are changed to mere button presses. While it's worth noting the Kickstarter success of Shantae Half-Genie Hero, for the purposes of our Metroidvania list, Pirate's Curse and 7 Sirens are the 2 best examples of WayForward's Metroidy chops. They're ret to go for you whenever you feel like playing lighter fare. The next pair is SteamWorld Dig and SteamWorld Dig 2. Similar to Shantae, we're going to tackle a pair of games in the same series available on Switch. SteamWorld Dig put developer Image and Form on the map when it hit 3DS in 2013, dazzling players with its mixture of digging exploration and handcrafted dungeons. It has an incredibly pleasing feedback loop where you accrue materials, digging through the underworld, then return to the surface to upgrade your hero, all the while finding new abilities and items along the way. For as good as the original game is, SteamWorld Dig 2, which hit Switch in 2017, blows it completely away. The world is deeper, the level design is better, the power-ups are even better. SteamWorld Dig 2 is one of the best of its kind on the Switch, and in my opinion, it might not even be Image and Form's best game. If we ever do some kind of turn-based strategy list, SteamWorld Heist will get all of my support. The next game, Sundered, was a bit of a late addition to this list, and the most striking thing about this game is its art and animation. It comes from Thunder Lotus Games, the team responsible for Jotun, as well as the upcoming Spiritfarer. With a Lovecraftian theme, Sundered blends the backtracking exploration of the Metroidvania with some light procedural generation. You explore ruins, trying to find new abilities, as well as shards that offer some choice into how you progress. These Elder Shards can be used by your heroine to add powerful abilities at the cost of corruption of her soul. Or you can destroy the shards to get a power boost and retain your humanity. Multiple endings spin out of those decisions. If there's one thing that is worth calling out that might make you pause on playing Sundered, there are a lot of cheap, randomly spawning enemies, and the overall procedural generation and roguelike leanings means the map changes each time you die. Much like Chasm, call back to earlier in the list, you can rewind if you missed it, the overall major map points are the same, it's just the paths between them that change. Chasm's implementation is definitely a little more elegant, but Sundered is still an enjoyable and challenging ride. And oh man, that artwork and that animation, love it. It's great. The Messenger is a game that, if you first play it without knowing anything else about it, you might wonder why it's even on this list. Because the game from Sabotage Studio starts off way more like a Ninja Gaiden game for a while. The linear structure of the early parts of the game do involve some power-up acquisition, but it's a lot more of a straightforward progression. Partway through, the world opens up and the Messenger transforms from something more traditional to something much more open-ended. If that sounds cool, skip ahead to the next game, because the next bit could be considered a little bit of a spoiler. The Messenger also switches from the present to the future, which also changes the visual style of your character from 8-bit to 16-bit inspired. That adds even more depth to the level design and challenges, which are enjoyable and varied, mixing a lot of humor into a relatively straight-laced story. There's even a free DLC segment that lets you mess around more in a new area after you beat the game. The next game, Timespinner, is one of the entries on this list that leans more Vania than Metroid, delivering an enjoyable, story-driven adventure where your heroine has to travel between two time periods to try to prevent a terrible future. Her main weapons are a pair of orbs that can be leveled and customized to do different types of attacks and damage. I have memories of the combat being a little rough around the edges, though the nicest parts of it are the fact that you can fine-tune what your abilities are. When I think back on playing Timespinner, the tremendous soundtrack sticks out. It's excellent. If I were to rank all these games, admittedly, Timespinner wouldn't be near the top, but with a runtime under 10 hours, it's a really enjoyable romp that scratches the pleasant exploration itches while delivering an enjoyable story and some soundly enjoyable combat. The next game actually first debuted on the Wii U. It's Toki Tori 2 Plus, and it has a weird, borderline tragic history. Toki Tori first came out on Game Boy Color. It was published by Capcom, much like Shantae originally was. Also like Shantae, it reached cult classic status. I recommend Toki Tori, but it's way more puzzle platformer than Metroid-y. Toki Tori 2 was a Wii U exclusive at launch in 2013, but thanks to the Wii U being, well, the Wii U, it wound up selling very poorly. It also was, at launch, a little hard to figure out. Your bird had two moves, whistle and stomp. Using those together in a wordless world would solve puzzles and progress the game. post-launch updates smoothed some of those confusing aspects, and honestly, playing Toki Tori 2 Plus now versus the original release in 2013 feels like night and day. Those smoothed out edges help to showcase what makes Toki Tori special. The puzzles are varied, smart, and challenging, making beautiful usage of limited commands. The animation, music, and art is still gorgeous. Just, even now, if you're frustrated, don't feel bad at glancing at a guide. We are finally at the end, and the final game here is Yoku's Island Express. Now, the concept of Metroidvania design being mixed with pinball isn't an obvious one, Metroid Prime Pinball notwithstanding, but somehow Yoku's Island Express makes it go together like peanut butter and chocolate. You play as a postman who travels all across an island, delivering some messages, but also waking an ancient deity. You know, as you do. The charming story plays out as you go through the world, which features numerous paddles and bumpers that will call to mind the layout of pinball tables. It follows a lot of the similar progression as your average Metroid-inspired game, but the novelty of the pinball mechanics carries the experience. Also, the art is really, really beautiful. Alright, so there's our list. We had more than 25 games, the Metroidvania games that you can check out on Switch today. We're going to have a little bit of a follow-up video later this week, where we're going to talk about some upcoming Metroidvanias on Switch, perhaps sequels to games that are on this list. And, yeah, if there's any games that we missed, feel free to shout them out in the comments. There are definitely games that aren't here, but, we had to draw the line somewhere. I'm recording the audio right now. We're nearing a half an hour of just audio without any other video stuff. So, it's a very long video. Thank you if you're hearing this part. And yeah, like I said, shout out other games that you like that are Metroidvania styled in the comments, and we'll pump those comments up or something like that, because let's just celebrate video games. They're real fun. Thanks for watching. Bye.
This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.